Well, Samsung is unveiling their new smartwatch today. The Samsung Gear S2 is set to come in 3 models and will run on a new operating system, Tizen. The round display will be Samsung's first aesthetic change and is just one of the features that sets it apart from its rival, the Apple Watch. Let's get out to Yoon in Seoul for more. Hi, Yoon.
Hi, Ariel, that's right. So we are seeing the Gear S2, just the details coming out now. It is the first watch for this year out of Samsung and also the first watch that is using the Tizen the operating system. Samsung had released 6 different watches in the past 2 years, but this is the first one that we are seeing its launch in 2014. So we are seeing a big change for it in terms of design and also the fact that it's running on a Tizen platform. It is said to be working with all different Android platforms, and also it will have Samsung Pay, not the full version, but it has the NFC version, which means that you can pay for things through a wireless touch system. And analysts are saying that the reason why Samsung didn't put in the full Samsung Pay version on the watch is because the technology would have made it heavier and bigger. So this version has a touch screen. It has a 1.2-inch diameter, and is said to have 4 gigabytes of storage on this watch. Again, it will run Samsung's Tizen operating system, and this right now is only found on TVs and also a very the low-end phones so far. So this is a big change for Samsung. Back to you.
Okay, Yoon, thanks so much for that. Look, stay with us. We're getting to Brian Ma now, VP of Client Devices Research at IDC Asia Pacific, who's joining us now live from Hong Kong. Welcome to the show today, Brian. You're concerned about the operating system, Tizen. Now, as Yoon just mentioned, it's the first time that this is going to go into the Samsung watch. But you say actually that this is going to make it difficult, I guess, less compatible with other apps.
Yeah. I mean, the issue is, of course, it's an operating system that really doesn't have a big base of devices, and there aren't really that many developers that are hovering around that ecosystem saying, oh, we've got to write an app for that device. And so if you're of the belief that apps really make the watch a more usable and more valuable kind of device, the challenge for Samsung is going to be getting enough developers to really write for it when they might be focused on other things like Apple Watch or Android Wear or whatever else it might be.
It just doesn't seem to make sense, Brian. I don't know if what you're saying is correct, and you're going to look for a watch on the market. Why would you choose this one? I mean, most people out there are not going to buy a gadget like this just because it's got a round face as opposed to a rectangular one.
Well, in Samsung's defense, I'd argue that a lot of consumers might not necessarily care about the OS as much, right? They'll be looking for other qualities and that kind of thing. And also in Samsung's defense, what they've done with Tizen on that watch, it actually does look pretty darn good. And they're obviously also trying to reduce their dependence on Google as far as Android goes, and so they've kind of invested quite a bit into Tizen. But the problem is, I'm worried that they're, in many ways, it's kind of like a, what do you call it? Like they're salvaging their efforts on all their investments that they made into that. They tried to do it in phones, didn't quite go anywhere. They're trying to push it into TVs, but again, mixed results. And it's kind of like, okay, well, why don't we park it into watches then? And at least, and again, in their defense, in the watch space, it's still early days, right? Apple is still getting started with its watch OS. Android Wear is only about a year or so into it. So it's a case where at least if you're looking at the app gap that we were talking about earlier, at least it's not as bad as it was in smartphones and that kind of thing. So maybe, at least in theory, and perhaps this is what they're thinking, that they're still early enough days where they can corral up and round up the developers and get people excited about it. But I wouldn't be placing my bets on it just yet.
Brian, what do you think? Do you think that this new smartwatch will be a game changer for Samsung? Will it actually be a threat to the Apple Watch in the smartwatch space?
No, not in its current form. I think, again, OS is part of the issue. The other issue is, especially if you're comparing to Apple, like you said, Apple's just got so much of a rabidly loyal fan base that, you get people buying Apple Watch just because it's coming from Apple, right? And so you've got so much momentum hovering around that, that it's, if I were to bet, I would still say you're gonna see Apple having the advantage on that. Samsung, it's not to say that they're not going to get momentum with this, of course, right? They've got so much cash, they've got channel presence that they can push a lot of this stuff down. And again, they're doing a decent job with the design such that it does look good. So I think the thing to watch for is, one, can they get enough application developer support around it? And maybe, depending on how the watch space develops, you could argue that apps actually might not matter as much. Maybe it's more just about simple notifications and that kind of thing. So we'll have to see how that industry develops. But I think at this point, to your question, I would say that it's more of an Apple play, or rather an Apple story, and Samsung is going to have a difficult time with that.
Well, Apple already, we should say, Brian, has 75% of the market, right, when it comes to the watch space. So they're already well ahead, a developing story when it comes to Samsung. Let's talk about Apple overall, Brian, because we saw this recovery in the share price in the overnight session, but it's been a hugely volatile month or so for Apple shareholders, which of course is impacting the entire market given the size of the company. Are you still a fan of Apple overall in comparison to some of the other tech plays, given the volatility and given the downside that we've seen? I mean, you can just see from this chart right now, we're sitting at 112.34 right now. That's some significant downside over the last couple of months.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's no doubting that there are challenges. There are a number of risks ahead, right? You talk about things including China. That's, of course, another short-term risk that we're looking at for them. However, I think a lot of this also just comes down to relativity and expectations, right? The challenge is Apple has just gotten so big, it's gotten so successful over the years that everybody's just got very high expectations. And if you look at just the huge base of revenue that they have, just calculating sheer growth numbers off the top of that, inherently, it gets difficult to get higher growth rates when that base is so big. So I would argue that Apple definitely is still in a very strong position. They're still going to be, particularly in terms of mind share, one of the leaders in the tech industry that basically the entire industry is kind of watching and in many ways following. But yes, in terms of from a financial perspective, in terms of stock price and so forth, the challenge I think is going to be that it's about expectations, and that's what we saw in last quarter's numbers as well too, right? People just had very, very high expectations. Apple came in a bit short of that for iPhones, but still, every other company in the industry would be dying to get those kinds of numbers. So it's really just more about the expectations than anything.
Okay, Brian, then let me ask you, who stands at the top of your list when it comes to this space, in the tech space right now?
Gosh, that's a very broad question, right? If you look at tech, you could talk about everything from enterprise, where HP and Dell are sitting, to what we were just talking about on the consumer stuff with Apple and that sort of thing. I guess we've talked about some of the leading players already, right? Apple is there, Samsung, granted, they're tumbling a bit, and I think it's going to be a bit of a challenge for them. But I think one up-and-comer that everybody does need to keep an eye on is Huawei. When you look at what Huawei's been doing in the past quarter, particularly in its home market of China, they've largely changed the perception, even in their home market, of being formerly what was a very low-end kind of a player to one that is something that's starting to command some high demand, right? There were phones in China this past quarter that they were rolling out that people were actually paying a premium for above the list price of the product because they were in shortage. And what we saw in Berlin last night then was now they're actually taking that on a global stage, right? They've been able to build up that reputation in their home market. Now on the global stage, they're trying to position themselves more towards the high-end space. They're building in a lot of interesting features that many of the other competitors don't have. And they're going to be one of those up-and-comers to watch. But the challenge for them, of course, is a lot of this really still is very hardware specific. And it's the same challenge that Samsung faced. Samsung has an edge in hardware as well, too. But Apple is the one that still really dominates the space because they drive a broader ecosystem rather than just playing on hardware and specs alone.
Broad question. Well answered, Brian. We always appreciate your time. Really good to have you with us on the program. Thanks for joining us today.
Sure.